The Democratic National Committee is scrapping the release of its autopsy of the 2024 election. DNC Chairman Ken Martin ordered the report months ago to dissect what went wrong for Democrats last year.
According to a DNC official, the analysis was based on hundreds of interviews conducted over several months. But now Martin believes it's best for the party to keep the report private. In a statement shared with The Hill, Martin says, quote, "In our conversations with stakeholders from across the democratic ecosystem, we are aligned on what's important, and that's learning from the past and winning the future. Here's our North Star," he says. "Does this help us win? If the answer is no, it's a distraction from the core mission."
Instead, Dems will look to build on their momentum after winning several key races in 2025 and try to take back power in Congress in next year's midterms. According to people familiar with the report, there was some contention among Democratic leaders over what it would and would not discuss. A New York Times article published in July says the report was expected to skirt around tough questions regarding Joe Biden's decision to run for re-election and whether Kamala Harris was the right person to replace him once he dropped out.
Some people, like former DNC advisor Daniel Wesser, supported the withholding of the report. He told the New York Times, quote, "Haven't we rehashed 2024 enough? We just won a bunch of elections this year. There is also a lot of good to be learned from there."
But online, many Democrats were upset and disgruntled by the news. Pod Save America host and former Obama speechwriter Jon Favreau writing on X, "Unreal. The DNC's actual position is that if the public knew more about what Democrats got wrong in the last election, it would hurt the party's chances in the next election. How does this rebuild trust between the party insiders and grassroots activists and organizers? Why does the party only trust people with the truth who are part of their insular club? And why on earth would the DNC think that keeping their promise to release the report would create more of a backlash than announcing that they're keeping it secret? Baffling."
And former DNC Vice Chair David Hogg says, "I ran for DNC Vice Chair after massive losses in 2024 because I believed we needed to change our party. Leadership disagreed with my work to primary asleep at the wheel incumbents and challenge the status quo. Now they are spiking an autopsy of the election that gave us Trump 2.0. Well, I'm kind of aligned with the David Hogg, Jon Favreau wing, as you might imagine there, Amber.
I agree. Yeah. I think that point about rebuilding trust is really important because, okay, the report's being suppressed, which means it's only being shared with a select number of party leaders, which means the really presumably important conclusions are not being communicated to a wider swath of the party or the party's activists, which means they're not getting the important intel that they need in order to course correct after 2024. And sure, they can say, well, we just won this, these special elections and these off-year elections, but what's stopping them now from reverting back to the policy positions or the messaging that cost them so dearly in the presidential?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely correct point. There are a lot of people who are left of centre on the political spectrum who have enormous frustrations with the DNC and have done for a long time. I mean, going way back to like 2016, they put a thumb on the scale to help Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders, for example. Here, it's just another example of what I think is frankly a very dumb decision, as well as one that is likely to sow the kind of distrust that you mentioned. Firstly, my assumption is that this report will leak anyway, so they've just created a kind of kerfuffle for no good effect. And then the information that they did release, and this goes directly to your point, was the most kind of anodyne stuff imaginable. In the statement from which we quoted, they went on to talk about things like we really should listen to voters. Now, there was also some suggestion that like peer-to-peer texting wasn't as effective as they'd hoped, or that when they were going around knocking on doors, they'd focused on quantity over quality and that kind of engagement. But all of those things are very vanilla, and they avoid what I think are certainly two of the biggest issues that face Democrats after the last election. One is the extent to which the whole Gaza issue played into Democratic dissatisfaction. We could get into that. But the other point is Kamala Harris's campaign spent about $1.5 billion in 15 weeks. Are there people who got a good chunk of that money who don't want to answer hard questions about it, or don't want their role looked at in a more heavily scrutinized way? it seems on its face like the answer to that is likely to be yes, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I think so. And also the lack of inclusion of Biden running for re-election and how long it took Democratic power brokers to finally force him out of the race. Also, Kamala Harris focusing a lot of her campaign on celebrity endorsements and these big rallies featuring people like Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, which frankly don't really appeal to the people in swing states that they really needed to win.
No criticism, no Cardi B slander in my face.
Like I don't have anything against the woman. I just, are voters worried about affordability in Pennsylvania really excited about Cardi B? No, probably not. And I think also this point about the decision to not release the report ends up becoming a bigger headline than the report itself, because now they're giving the impression that they have something to hide. And I'm also curious about what the interviews were. They said they did hundreds of interviews. With whom, right? Was it with members of the party? Was it with voters? Was it with consultants? I think that alone would be really instructive as to how useful this report actually is. And to your point, this question of, or the anodyne release of details like our text campaign didn't work that well. I could have told you that in October of 2024 because I was getting texts from the DNC asking me to go knock doors for Kamala Harris. Sorry, but if I'm getting texts from you to go knock doors for Kamala Harris, I think your microtargeting campaign really sucks.
I was going to say, if they were doing one of those like five-point gauges for how supportive people are likely to be, I don't think I would have you listed as the most likely Kamala Harris.
I mean,
candidacy.
I guess what I think happened is and I've been saying this for a while, but when I talk to Democratic consultants versus Republican consultants, what they say the primary differences between their targeting campaigns is that the Democrats really focus on demographics, whereas Republicans focus on things like media consumption, lifestyle habits, etc. And also like socioeconomic status. But they probably saw, white 30-something woman in Northern Virginia, gotta be a Democrat, right? Also works in media.
Yeah.
Whereas the Republicans are actually looking at voting history, attends church regularly,
Sure.
and
what TV shows you watch, or
right,
whatever.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think they rely on a very basic and old-fashioned method of looking at voter patterns as opposed to more specific data.
The other point in the arguments that have been made about this report that I think is important, and where I think the DNC's position is kind of nonsensical, is this idea that, well, we just won 2 or 3 big elections this year, so we shouldn't go back then to 2024. And it's like, no, just as a basic empirical idea, you look at what works, which is whether it's Mamdani or Mikey Sherrill or whoever, it doesn't really matter, and then you go back and look at what doesn't work,
right.
And you're like, what are the differences between these two things? One shouldn't disqualify the other. I find that a very bizarre idea. Anyway, today is the deadline for the long-awaited release of the Epstein files. Coming up, why some have suggested the files may not be as transparent as many Americans would hope. Stay with us.